Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars video. This is going to be my review for The Mandalorian Season 3, Episode 8, the finale for Season 3. So, how was this finale? Did it meet expectations? And I thought it was definitely an interesting episode in that sense, because I think most people probably went in expecting there to be a few more twists and turns, for in a way, the way the kind of plot went to be a little bit more complicated than it actually ended up being. Instead, little moments like, say, Din not even making it to the interrogation and actually, taking out guards on the way, and Grogu, arriving immediately on the scene to kind of free him, was kind of like, okay, that certainly simplifies kind of what we're trying to do here. Similarly, it seems like a lot of the speculation about if we have a traitor kind of Mandalorian in our midst was for nothing, really. Now, why exactly the previous episode was called Spies, plural, I'm not exactly sure. I know some people were speculating that it's just because the Mandalorians on the planet were kind of quote-unquote scouts, which is kind of a spy of sorts. Is that what we were referring to? Or is it because Moff Gideon is like a spy master type character, so it's like him plus Elia? Is that what we were talking about? But it's just, I think, little bits and pieces like that, where I think if I was recording my review after my first watch through of the episode, I might have been a little bit like, it didn't quite meet my expectations. But watching it a second time just before this video, I think the episode flows a bit better. I'm like, okay, they're taking this approach of they're not overcomplicating it. And ultimately, I think we all sort of want some form of a kind of happy ending. And that's exactly what they did here. We didn't lose any of our notable characters for the most part in this episode in terms of the hero side of things. Of course, they seemingly for good got rid of Moff Gideon, but we'll get into it. And I think beyond that, the most interesting point is just where does this leave us for the next season of The Mandalorian? And also, where does this leave us for sort of the Mandoverse? Because we're building up, of course, to the recently announced Dave Filoni directed kind of Avengers-esque movie that is set in this era, that's set in the New Republic era, utilizing Mandalorian, Ahsoka, and all the other shows set around this time. Where does this set us for that? So let's get into all of that as we kind of get into the episode here. So, like I said, we're straight into the action. The episode literally kicks off immediately from where the previous one ended. And yeah, we get straight away, this is a big action set piece. We have to address the difference between the Mandalorian fleet that's on the ground, and then the fact that we had sent Axe up to get help from above. But also, Din is being carted off for interrogation. And like I said, he just turns the table on the two guys who are taking him. He manages to basically defeat one of them, then Grogu arrives to save the day with the other one. So you have Mando and Grogu reunited, and basically they're exploring the base. So that group is separated from the rest of the Mandalorians, so they regroup while Din basically goes in search of kind of Gideon, because he knows that's what he needs to do. The axe stuff and the armorer stuff is just I guess she did exactly what she said she was going to do. That's effectively it. That's where the reinforcements sort of end up coming from. Axe gets up to the ship and is just okay, everyone get out, get to the drop ships. I'm taking command of the capital ship here. And he then proceeds to kind of crash it into the base. Now, this, of course, takes place over the course of most of the episode, with the big kind of finale happening as the capital ship hits Gideon's base, while all the action is still happening. Now, the main characters that the crash ends up impacting is Din, Grogu, Bo-Katan, and Gideon, who are having their big fight on the kind of in the base. But we'll get to that, of course. So that was fine. Axe doesn't seem to be a traitor, and in fact, the episode makes it abundantly clear that he is extraordinarily loyal and that's fine. No traitor stuff whatsoever. Similarly, the armorer was just like, okay, I guess we were suspecting her for no particular reason. There's still the case of, like, she doesn't go by any name, and her helmet has horns, and what's going on there, but otherwise, everything seemed perfectly fine. Similarly, the other potential spy candidates, the Mandalorians we found who remained on the planet all this time, again, they revealed that they didn't have any ill intentions. Obviously, there's a little bit of sort of clunkiness about the fact that, like, wait, you've been on the planet. How did you not realize that this base was here? They could have explained that, like, sort of the last time we were in this area was like a year or two ago or something like that, just to make it make a little bit more sense. But ultimately, it worked out fine. As everyone like escapes before we get the sort of attack with the reinforcements, we get a nice kind of little world building moment on Mandalore, where we get the idea that there are these kind of like underground kind of farms, effectively, which the remaining Mandalorians have managed to construct themselves by like growing plants, the original plant life that is on the surface. So again, sort of establishing I guess a kind of pseudo Coruscant-esque kind of thing with Mandalore, that, oh yeah, like plants in kind of more modern Mandalore are only grown in the kind of like glass cities, basically, which aren't really like nature focused like at all. That the planet has like evolved so much technologically that they've kind of almost gone past the need for nature. But obviously the intervening years have allowed the actual planet itself to sort of heal to a certain extent, and now they're reintroducing the original kind of plants and so on back to the kind of ecosystem. So that's a nice thing, in that you assume the new kind of modern Mandalore now is going to be sort of like a blend of what we saw in like the Clone Wars, and they're not going to kind of make the mistakes maybe in the past and utilize a little bit more of nature in everything going on. So that was a nice kind of small but I think subtle and well done scene that adds quite a bit to, I think, what's going on here. So that was, I think, pretty strong to see. While all this is happening, this is where like Din and Grogu are basically, they call in like R5 to be like, okay, we need you to kind of link in and get rid of the energy kind of barriers that Moff Gideon walked through in the previous episode. We need you to get rid of them one by one, because to get to Gideon, we have to go through them. So there's a pretty cool action here, of course, as Din, who basically has no weaponry at this point because it's all been removed from him, has to like kind of one by one take on first, two of them, grabs the knife, and that's how he takes out those guys. As he goes through, he gradually builds up some equipment, gets the jetpack, gets some blasters, and so he goes in with a bit of a hodgepodge mix of weaponry, but still, this is sort of the whole Mandalorian way of like, he knows how to use all different forms of weaponry, and because of the kind of mix and match nature of their armor and stuff like that it can be replaced, it all kind of is interchangeable, which I thought was a really kind of nice little thing to do. And yeah, the action, I thought, throughout the episode was actually really, really strong. Very dynamic, a lot of kind of sliding kind of stuff going on. Din doing a few more kind of like acrobatic moves as well, which was kind of good. But we eventually get to Din versus Moff Gideon. So of course he's in his armor and stuff like that. But just before, I almost brushed past this, even though it's super important. The room with the clone. So we saw a little bit of this in the previous episode, but we couldn't quite make out what exactly is going on. I think I saw a few people predict that this would be the way it worked, and that, okay, Moff Gideon is doing some cloning research himself, and it is in fact to make clones of himself. So, and then add on to that he also wants to make clones of himself that are improved. And the reason he mentioned Jedi in the previous episode is because he wants to have the Force as well. So he's trying to do research to get that, in addition to his clones being sort of like upgraded versions of himself as well. Now, they seem to get across the idea that based on what Moff Gideon says, Din, in opening up all the pods before they're quote-unquote ready, has basically killed the clones before they have even taken their first breath. So, and then that plus, I guess, the base kind of blowing up is kind of, I guess, the confirmation of that. But interesting motivation for sure. I like what they did with Moff Gideon. The idea that he is this character who, without properly like respecting the cultures of these other kind of people he goes up against, just wants to take the best parts of them and sort of like add them onto himself. So the Mandalorian armor, he wants the Mandalorian darksaber, but he also wants to have the Force like the Jedi do. And that's all he really cares about, it, nothing else. And in a show that for the most part has been dealing with kind of aspects of like the various kind of rituals of different cultures, you know, he makes for actually a quite interesting villain as like a character who doesn't respect them and in fact only wants these important aspects to like improve himself and make himself more powerful. So we get the fight here, and Din does the best that he can, but of course, like, he's been fighting this whole time, whereas Moff Gideon, this is his like first fight today, and he's ultimately in the ascendancy here. You think Grogu arriving, of course, in the mech suit, of course, is going to help, but this is where we remember the Praetorian Guards are still around. So they come in, and Grogu's forced to sort of like kite them away, and it's a quite dramatic shot because you're like, we don't know if there's much weaponry on that suit, and they basically confirm there really isn't. There's like a Bacta spray, of course, that we see get used. Otherwise, you know, it's obviously strong because it's a droid, but there's no weaponry as such, or at least Grogu doesn't know how to use it. And so the mech suit just gets destroyed almost immediately as this goes on. But of course, on the other side of the episode, this is where the reinforcements come in, and we get the attack of the Mandalorians on the base. Very cool thing is you get sort of like the cavalry charge of like the full line of jetpacks charging at each other. Bo using the darksaber, and the armorer using again her kind of melee weapons, the blacksmith's kind of tools as well. So that was really nice to see. I think the way they shot that worked kind of pretty well. The way they were able to just zoom in on specific kind of moments and get some creative angles. Like, you cut to like the perspective of one of the guys charging in, and you just see like the armorer just like appear like and take him out. That was, I think, quite good. And then in the middle of all the fighting happening, of course, Bo spots Gideon fighting Din. She arrives in, and of course they had to do this scene, the sort of redemption where Bo actually gets to fight Moff Gideon and not do kind of what she did before. So she uses the darksaber against, of course, him in his armor, and he's using basically an electro staff type thing. And it's a pretty good fight. She gets some decent hits in. There's like one moment where she gets like a shot in or around his neck, but like it's deflected just about by the top of his armor. But in a surprise kind of turn of events, one of the most surprising things they probably do in the episode is Gideon is like, you know, give me, I want the darksaber. But then in the next exchange, he predicts one of her moves, grabs her hand that has the darksaber in it, and basically just like crushes it. The implication, I think, seems to be that he like hurts her hand as well, but he breaks the darksaber. So the way they showed it, it's not like completely like devastated, but the device, the actual like mechanism that is a lightsaber, has been broken. Now I'm assuming the darksaber crystal isn't broken, and there's a chance in the future for it to be reforged, because that's probably one of the more interesting things. It's a very unusual hilt, so it would be nice to actually see the darksaber, the black blade, get a more kind of a nicer, I think, looking lightsaber hilt. But the question is going to be like, who exactly does that? Because okay, you have expert blacksmiths here, but the idea is that I suppose the mechanism of a lightsaber, none of the Mandalorians would as such know how to construct that. So who can you bring in to make this kind of actually work? And you're kind of thinking like, well, Ahsoka, I guess, could do something like that. She would know more of that. But the idea is, are we rebuilding, reforging a lightsaber just to give it back to Bo? Is that the idea here, or are we building it kind of for theoretically someone else? I'm not really sure, because I think a lot of people are maybe leaning towards like, are you gonna give like the dark saber to Grogu, but like you forge it in a way where it's more for him? I'm not really sure about if they necessarily want to do that. But still, it was a very, very surprising moment, given that like you actually gave at least a little bit of focus this season to the idea of getting the Darksaber into the right character's hands and what it represented, but ultimately that she could still be the leader without it. Like, it's not an absolute requirement, especially because like it got broken in battle, of course. So, pretty cool stuff. Obviously around this time, like everyone kind of like turns back. Like, Din, when Bo arrives on the scene, Din, of course, is allowed to go after Grogu. Grogu gets his cool fight against the Praetorian Guards, where like he has to get out of the suit because it gets destroyed, and he starts force flipping around the place. But eventually, they kind of trap him under some of the kind of lighting structure, and that's when Din comes in, and we get, I felt, a very, very cool action scene where I think they're still doing this in the right way. They're not having Grogu suddenly become this like amazing combatant, but he plays this like support role using the Force really well to allow Din to just about get through the fight against the three Praetorian Guards and kind of beat them. There was a lot of, I think, care and attention put on this fight scene when it came to like the orientation of the room, where each character's weapon is, which isn't something that was particularly thought about during the Last Jedi fight scene involving the Praetorian Guards. So just little moments of like Grogu making it so that the fight is never properly 3-on-1. That there's always someone knocked over by the Force. If someone drops their weapon, he's Force pushing the weapon away. That was, I thought, very good use of Grogu, like their kind of tag team stuff going on here. And then, of course, Mandalorians work best together. That's when everyone arrives, but it's also when the ship is on the verge of coming in. And I'm glad they did have like the kind of moment of like Axe breaks the window and gets out. That there wasn't a need for him to go down with the ship in this case. And I think he will be a character who I would like to see again. So, then we get the cool moment where like the fight is obviously going on and like they're aware the ship is coming, but they can't just ignore the fight. And so when it finally hits, Bo, Din, and Grogu are all like right next to each other, and Bo tries to shield them using her little energy shield, but obviously it's not going to be enough because this is a full like giant ship crashing into an Imperial base. Like there's a massive explosion that goes off, and so Gideon, who's right next to the edge, gets immediately caught in it. And like, especially because of how long the Force protection from Grogu goes on, you have to be like, yeah, Gideon is dead. Very, very clearly Gideon is dead. But especially because, yeah, like I said, how much they linger on Grogu using the Force to hold back the explosion. Kanan-esque, of course. Very, very cool moment there for Grogu. I think they used him quite well in this episode. Even if I still feel like his story still needs a bit more, maybe they could have done more this season. That like the story of how he got out of the Jedi Temple, it feels like, are we going to come back to that and kind of cover where he went from there, or is that something for the future? I'm not really sure. But yeah, this leads to the victory here. The base is destroyed. Gideon is dead. His clones are dead. Is he fully gone, I suppose, is the question. Because what if there's another clone somewhere? What if the one that got killed there was actually a clone? What if the real Gideon is still out there somewhere? There's ways you can go either way with this. Because there's definitely use for an established character who I think people actually like as a villain. But because they had already set up the whole Thrawn connection, and of course we've seen the Ahsoka trailer, I feel like you don't have to keep Gideon in play. You can treat this as his death, and that his death now means the opposition to Thrawn from the Shadow Council is very minimal. And so it sets up the next stage of like the villains at the moment is Thrawn. And the next show we are getting is Ahsoka in a couple of months. And I think that's perfect. Do you need to add the extra layer of Gideon is still around and he doesn't want Thrawn to come into play? I'm not overly sure, but you do have to keep in mind there are still little elements out there like Elia. She's still out there. We didn't like address like where this leaves her. She's obviously still allied with the Empire, but now that the person she's been dealing with is dead, as far as we're aware, what happens there? What is there anything else with Pershing? Because it feels like we need Pershing's information to progress Project Necromancer. How does this all come about? Is it going to be part of maybe Thrawn's plan that he was like aware of this, and so she joins Thrawn? That could be something to do. But again, I'm not overly sure. So after that, what we get is basically, you know, we've retaken Mandalore. Like we set out to do earlier on this season, we have retaken Mandalore, and we get the completion of Ragnar's ceremony, where he becomes like a Mandalorian apprentice, I guess. He takes the creed in the place where, of course, Din restored his honor effectively. And then the big point that they go for here is that Din brings Grogu over to basically have the same thing happen. He wants Grogu to advance from being a foundling to being an apprentice. But the armorer says, no, he can't. He's too young. He can't even speak yet. Din is like, if his parent speaks for him and allows it, it is possible. And she makes the point that we don't know where his parents are. They may not even be alive. So Din, in a way, finally makes the full kind of commitment to, I will adopt him. I will treat him as my son. And it's just, this is the way. And so Grogu is now Din Grogu, and he is accepted in and is now a Mandalorian apprentice. And we get a nice little shot where he kind of, I guess, force senses into the water. And I guess the idea is that Grogu roughly knows the mythosaur is down there. We do get the mythosaur again, though the other characters don't see it. So I wonder, again, what the setup exactly is about there. The forge, of course, gets reignited, and we have the celebration that, you know, Mandalore is on the way back, which, in combination with the kind of reveal of like the farm that the plant life is able to grow in the surface, feels like it's a pretty big thing with the restoration of Mandalore. So exciting times where like the two tribes are now kind of united. Bo is their leader, and there doesn't seem to be a dispute over that. This battle seems to have brought the two tribes together, and there doesn't seem to be really any infighting anymore. So we'll see where this goes. Like, this obviously brings up the question, especially with what we're about to get into with where they end the season for Din and Grogu. Are we getting a Book of Bo-Katan? Is that how we're going to continue this side of the story? In my mind, I think it is, because I think that's what they've kind of done here with this, is brought Bo-Katan into the forefront a little bit more, given her key position, in the same way that the Book of Boba Fett kind of put him into like a very, very key position. But it still feels like there's room to work with here, but it now has to be a little bit more Bo as the leader. What is our plan for Mandalore now that we're back here on the planet? What is the trajectory for Mandalore? Because I don't think we have many references to the future of Mandalore in like other materials. So this is an open plot thread to see where exactly they head with this. And especially because the trajectory for Din and Grogu is they now have to go off on a journey. Because the expectation of a Mandalorian apprentice is that they leave and they go on journeys of their own. And so Both of them have to go because, of course, of Grogu's age, and Din has to support his son. So what are we doing here? So we obviously go back to Navarro. This is where Din sort of accepts the house, the little bit of land that he was given, so they have a place to live. IG-11 gets kind of brought back here, of course. So Navarro now has a kind of sheriff, effectively. And what he wants to do is he wants to assist the New Republic. He's going to step back from some of the other sides of bounty hunting and is going to be effectively a bit of a mercenary type character for the New Republic. So interesting stuff, but the way they end it very much is like, and we'll see what happens next. It feels like that was a somewhat definitive ending, but it's, I think, very clear, like, Din is going to be utilized quite heavily leading into that Dave Filoni movie, but we're quite a few years away from that, so there's still potentially room for 2, maybe even 3 seasons of The Mandalorian, but we don't really know what the plan is. I take this as being, I think we're probably heading back to maybe season 4 being a little bit more like season 1, where the episodes maybe are a little bit more kind of one-off. It is very much the journeys of Din and Grogu. But we have our characters in slightly different positions now, where we have a bit of a path for Grogu. There's the potential to tell the rest of his backstory at some point. Din himself, of course, apart from just protecting Grogu, you know, is there any inherent arc there as such? I think ultimately it was a right choice to not really have him have any sort of ambition towards like wanting to lead on Mandalore. He assists Bo because they have a friendship there, and that's kind of really all there is to say about that. This is always what he has wanted. Like, this is his people. He follows the creed. That's what he's about. And that's where, like, they're going to have to do something, I guess, with season 4. Because if you just go straight back to an exact season 1 approach, will that work? Obviously, I guess there will be still some sense for, like, Grogu is still going to be needed to make Project Necromancer happen. But who is that going to be? Is that going to be where we get maybe a Thrawn crossover with the Mandalorian? Is Thrawn going to assist with Project Necromancer, or is that something that completely happens in the background? And I think that's probably it. It's like we're still waiting to see what the exact crossover potential for a lot of this stuff is. Because so far, the crossover has been the Mandalorian appeared in the Book of Boba Fett. And we haven't really seen maybe some of the other stuff, like the others appearing in the Mandalorian. So I don't know. It's an unusual situation, but I think this is fine because we are still a couple of years away from what's next. Again, the fact that I suppose the information out of Celebration was a little wishy-washy about sort of like Mandalorian specifically and the future is a bit kind of confusing. But it feels like, yeah, like we have to continue the Mandalore arc, and it probably has to be a Book of Bo-Katan type thing. That's there's definitely potential there. I'm guessing we'll see more Boba Fett. Will it be a Book of Boba Fett 2 type thing? I'm not overly sure, but maybe that's where you use season 4 as like okay, it's Din and Grogu on some adventures, but like, hey, here's Boba Fett for an episode. That kind of feels like a way to reverse the Book of Boba Fett situation a little bit and help that character. That's probably, I think, a good kind of position to do it in, to keep Boba Fett in people's minds, because it is part of this era overall. We're not just going to forget about it. But yeah, overall, I enjoyed this episode. I still go back to the fact that I think it was like, I definitely had like different expectations versus what was actually delivered. But I ultimately am pretty happy with what we got. Certainly, some of the sort of like how well fully planned together is all of this stuff. This felt a little bit like maybe plans were different, like a little bit ago, but then we've had to have this bit of a weird transition season that did stuff in kind of weird ways. But we're in a pretty good position, I think, with Mandalore set up, a good arc for Bo-Katan, and probably Din and Grogu in the position most people kind of want them in for more of those kind of more classic style Mandalorian episodes. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on the episode, but that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.